Welcome back to another reading and correcting with me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and I, the Tiger Supervisor. These are where I read a chapter from one of my stories and correct it as I go. If you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. And if you are looking to support me, that is on my Patreon. Today, I am doing chapter 94 of, let's not double click, Stepping Wild. Tibs woke with a start, saw the blood covering him, the massacre around him, then the memories assaulted him. He threw up. He saw a lot of red meat in it, and he threw up again. Then he forced himself up, used purity to stop his legs shaking, and ran. Ran from what he woke among, and the wildness he remembered, the things he'd done. At least it had only been to animals. Not that it brought him much comfort. Dropping torrents of water on him cleaned his body, but did little to make him feel clean. It hadn't been him, it had been fever. Except he'd learned to remain himself while channeling fever, and this hadn't been like the previous times. There had been a lack of focus in what he'd felt, where before he'd mainly wanted something, even when that something was only to run until something else pulled at him. Here he'd wanted everything. It was like how fire had caused him to be before he learned to remain himself. If he controlled himself while channeling either, why was channeling both cause for such an extreme reaction? He reached the clearing his camp was in before he had an answer. What he'd rebuilt after the explosion was mostly intact. The ripped and burned clothing, the only sign, I don't need real, the only sign something had happened to him before he ran off to, he forced the memory down. He didn't want to think about that. How had his bracers survived? He'd felt confined by the clothing. He had needed that off him, so he'd use fire on everything that held him back. He didn't remember his bracers registering as such, even when his boots had. Had he worn them so long he didn't feel them? So long they were part of him? Or was it that they were immune to what he'd done? The set Stowe made him had been resilient, and the one Fearman made to replace them was fresh weaving, and he might have added to what was there, what had been there. The work had always been too intricate for Tibs to sense the details. Whatever the reason, he was glad. He packed up and moved deeper into the forest. He couldn't risk anyone coming within his sense until he had control, and that meant understanding how it had happened. He shuddered at the thought he needed to go through what he'd experienced again. He rolled to his side on waking up and threw up before his eyes were open. He focused on before he'd lost control instead of what he'd done this time. He'd been fine while channeling fever. He'd etched, moved essence, and there had been no pull to give in to the desire of his body. He'd attempted to be slow in how he channeled fire, hoping to ease the transition, but it had roared in, had consumed the space within his reserve, and then he focused on before he ran. Fire exploded within his reserve. It hadn't mixed with fever, which had been Tibbs's first thought to explain his loss of control. If they had become a new element, he couldn't have known how to deal with that. But just as with earth and fire, they coexisted in his reserve. Not separate as they were in his minuscule reserve, they moved against each other, but remained distinct. But he had remained himself. Actually, it's right here. I should probably start using this one. Train myself for that. what he'd done was more than what happened while he practiced gaining control of fever. That element was of the body, of the need of using it, of feeding it, not only his stomach, all its needs. Even those Tibbs didn't feel the rest of the time. This time and the previous, Tibbs had gone wild. He had been no better than an animal, no thoughts, only giving into everything his body wanted. He shuddered and steered his mind away from those memories. The only way he was able to think of it was the simplest. He'd acted as if fire had taken fever and pushed it beyond what it was, the way it had done with his emotions before he gained control. Then why hadn't fire done the same when he channeled it and water or earth? Something he'd learned in reading so many texts was about setting and testing theories of the test if the test of a theory under similar circumstances caused completely different result, the theory was wrong. What was his theories? What was his theory here? He forced himself to look around at the dead animal. None of the fights had been fair. He'd been consumed by fever. He could have thought them dead, but instead he'd fallen on them and sunk his teeth into flesh, ripped that and the fur out, ate them before they were done dying. He fought the urge to throw up. This showed why he needed control. He couldn't trust himself to channel only one element. Now that he knew he could, he'd been put in he'd be put in situation as with Alistair, where he wouldn't be able to come up with another way to win. Then he'd have to deal with the fallout. The dead animals were partially eaten, as if a few deadly bites had satisfied that hunger. But there had been hunger for another of the animals, hunger to eat them, or he definitely didn't want to think about that. He gathered two of the largest ones, wolves, and considered his theory on the walk to his camp. He'd need leather for clothing and dry meat for the travels. His theory was that fire pushed the other element beyond his control. He'd known his theory was wrong, but now he knew how it was wrong. Fire hadn't been the one responsible for what had happened. Technically, neither was fever. It was their similarity. He'd always known fire and water, as well as earth. He'd already known fire and water, as well as with fire with water, as well as with earth, didn't cause a change, so he'd studied what happened when he channeled it and one of the other two. It had meant letting himself feel the changes, something he'd learned to stop a long time ago. And that had been harder than he expected, but once he managed it, he noticed it. Fire and water were the easiest to notice. Water caused him to be calm, to soothe, to help. He'd been so relaxed, he'd almost decided against continuing, to simply rest there. But he remembered himself enough to continue with the experiment. He'd channeled fire, which was about extremes, letting himself go, feeling beyond all measure, doing, not resting, unleashing, not soothing. And the pull had been there, not the ignition of water as his theory called for. Fire making him feel so much of it he lost control. The pull had been toward fire and fire toward water. Because of their differences, it was easy to remain himself. His test with fire and earth caused a similar result. Earth was about slowing down. There was no point in ever hurrying, while fire wanted to act now. It had no patience. When they pulled at each other, fire's demand for immediate action was tempered by Earth's patience, and he was able to remain himself. Confident of his new understanding, he channeled fire and fever. He looked at the result and forcefully didn't think about the other things he'd done with them. Knowing what would happen, I hadn't let him keep control because instead of diminishing each other, the pull of the two elements had reinforced each other. But now he knew what to train for, and then he'd have to test each combination of elements. But that came after he mastered this one. He needed so much it hurt him. Needed to run, eat, mate, defecate, everything. With being still was so painful. He couldn't understand why he subjected himself to it, other than he had made the decision to torture himself like this. He hated himself. He screamed. He cursed, but didn't throw up. How many failed attempts now? How many days, weeks had he been at this? He had no sense of how much time passed once he lost control. If he trusted himself not to use these two elements in a fight, he'd swear the combination off and stick with fire and water or earth, but not air. Both these elements were about giving into aspect of himself, and they had fed on each other. He'd laughed and run, set fires, and only the pain of being burned had brought him back he kept it from spreading. He gathered the bear's body and returned to his camp. No! He shoved himself off the animal and it ran off. He'd almost chased it, the need to continue, a need so strong it hurt. No, he didn't want this need. He didn't want this need. He didn't want this. He wasn't fever. He wasn't fire. He was Tibs. And he didn't want to do that with the animal to himself. Need! He sighed. At least he'd remembered himself and hadn't maintained control, but at least he remembered himself. He hadn't maintained control, but he'd remembered who he was. He had to consider this an improvement. Stop! I said stop! The animal ran off, and this time he didn't even entertain the idea of chasing it. He was Tibs Lightfingers. He was a person. He had limits. He had to deal with the consequences of his actions. And he didn't want to do this. None of it. He let go of the element. No dead animals, so he returned himself sooner. He'd also been himself enough to remember he didn't have to channel the elements. Definite improvement. I need. I want. I don't have to give into what I need or want. He trembled. Actually, this is going to be that. This is italicized. This and that. Because this is active thought. He trembled from the needs, the desires, but he stayed still. Thinking was difficult, but acknowledging what made the elements seemed to soothe them, helped him remember he was separate from them. They were part of him and the world, but they had to be in equilibrium. Everything alive had wants and needs. They were a part of how the elements that made up everything manifested in them. But they, like him, weren't the elements. He was Tibs Lightfingers, and he was the one in charge. He opened his eyes. He was in his camp. He wanted to run, to chase, to eat, to do other things, but with a few exceptions, they were things he wanted at one time or another. He hadn't given into those desires, those times. He didn't have to now. He dressed in the set of clothing he'd made of the pelts he'd collected and set about gathering wood, remaining aware of who he was the entire time. Fever and fire pulled, but he was used to it. He needed to eat. His temper exploded at times. They intensified them because it was what they were, but he didn't have to give in to them. He'd satisfy the urges that were his when it was appropriate. He moved the raw essence around him. Fire through fever, and over and under. He felt their pull, but remembering who he was became easier each time he did this. They were part of him, but not him. He sensed the animals trotting through the trees. When it stopped, he formed a fire blast etching with fire and fed it fever. The heat of the blast was the closest word he could think of. The three the tr- the tree barely had marks from the blast, but it consumed the animal entirely. Its life essence hadn't leaked out, caused it to die. It had dissipated once there was no body left to contain it. Okay, this is actually wrong. If it's a wet heat, steaming, mound. And there's been once. Come back here. Yeah, I'm gonna have to. I am going to have to learn to work less with the buttons of the mouse because clicking tends to double and triple clicks. Even that's not there. Once its body had been turned into a steaming mound of flesh-like residue. Da, 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 da. So I don't. Pale and soggy. If he hadn't sensed it as it happened, he wouldn't have known this was the remains of an animal or of anything. He stepped away, he formed a fire blast etching, and without releasing fever, fed it fire essence, directing it at the remains. Nothing about Tibs changed, no shift in the essence within his reserve. Channeling both didn't mean he was forced to always use both. I don't need the always here. Wasn't forced to use both. It simply increased the range of what he could do. He smiled. If he could remain himself for a few more days, he'd considered himself good to return to his journey. And that concludes chapter 94 of Stepping Wild. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next chapter will be up, subscribe and ring the bell. If you want to read this story, it is available for free on Royal Road. If you want to read ahead of that by about 20 chapters and support me in the process, that is on Ream Story. And if you want to listen to these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch and YouTube. Links are in the notes. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.